why do you think we need control? Why would we need to control these reactions? Specifically these. Why would we need to control the ones in stage 1? Well, yeah, we don't want to be making energy, but also here we're investing ATP. So we're using energy. And then sometimes we control parts that we don't need to go further. Maybe these intermediates can be used for other things. Or whenever we have a net, very spontaneous reaction. So I want to point out one thing, is this little star here, it needs the oxidized form of NAD. It needs NAD without the hydrogen on it. What happens if you don't have NAD without the hydrogen on it? You have to make it. And you get some lactic acid. So that's what we're going to actually talk about next after we're done with glycolysis, what happens afterwards. But it's very important that you understand that this step, going from glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate to 1,3-bis-phosphoglycerate, we need to add that other phosphate on there. We need NAD. Do you need oxygen around to have glycolysis occur? No. This is an anaerobic pathway. And every cell does this. Where does it happen? In the cytosol. So here's our regulatory enzymes: hexokinase, PFK, and pyruvate kinase. You need to know the activators and the inhibitors. So fructose 1,6-bisphosphate is an activator because it is an intermediate from above. So if you have high levels of fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, it's like water piling up in the stream above it. So it's going to push it forward. High levels of ATP, of course, is going to inhibit all of our reactions. Pretty easy multiple choice question, right? And then acetyl-CoA is our entry molecule into the citric acid cycle. So if we have a lot of acetyl-CoA building up, meaning that we don't need the energy, so it's going to inhibit this last step. Citrate is also an intermediate downstream. Let's talk about the ATP a little bit. We're going to use ATP in a couple steps where we're phosphorylating the dangly carbons. Carbon number 6 on glucose to get glucose 6-phosphate. We isomerize to get fructose, and then we're going to phosphorylate the other dangly carbon, fructose, the carbon number 1 on fructose. So we get fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. So we're using up 2 ATPs. But we're producing ATP in duplicate. One where we're taking off that inorganic phosphate, and the other one where we're going in our last step, PEP to pyruvate. But this happens in duplicate, so there's 2 steps, so we have 4 altogether. So this is our net reaction. Glucose, we need 2 of our NADs. 2 of our NADs to, in order for this to occur. We make 2 pyruvates, 2 NADHs that are going to go to the electron transport chain, and 2 ATPs. I don't necessarily have you write out the net reaction. What I do is I ask questions about it. This is supposed to be a delta. So the steps that are controlled. glucose to glucose 6-phosphate, fructose 6-phosphate to fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, and PP to pyruvate have very negative delta G values. Those are the reactions I want you to focus on. The rest of the reactions are, have delta Gs that are close to 0. So the Chatelier's principle is going to govern whether they go forward. Remember that delta G is a state function. A state function meaning that it only depends on initial and final conditions. So it doesn't matter that they are catalyzed by enzymes. Overall, glycolysis gives off negative 73.4 kilojoules. Remember, this is delta G, not prime. Okay, so it's sort of artificial. If we turn in our ATPs that we make, we get 30.5 times 2. So overall, glycolysis makes negative 134.4 kilojoules per mole. Very, very energetic. Exergonic. Without making ATP, it would be much more exergonic, but it would be lost as heat. Let's go back for document camera and finish up. I want you to think of metabolism of glucose. The catabolic metabolism of glucose is taking every carbon and burning it. We are ultimately going to get to carbon dioxide for every carbon, just like as if you were to have a campfire, right? You're taking the glucose in the wood and making carbon dioxide and water, and that's what we're doing. But by doing it in a slow, stepwise manner, we're burning our glucose in a slow, stepwise manner, we can capture that. If you just burn the food, right, burn the glucose, it's lost its heat. It's too fast. We can't capture that energy. But by having these reactions, these redox reactions happening stepwise, then we're able to capture that energy in the molecule ATP. For stage 2, the only enzyme that I'm going to ask you to remember the name and everything about it is the pyruvate kinase. So what happens after glycolysis? We have 2 pyruvates. The 2 pyruvates. The ATPs can be used, but the 2 pyruvates, what are we going to do with them? It depends whether we have oxygen around or not. If we don't have oxygen around, then we are going to do anaerobic glycolysis. We're going to do anaerobic glycolysis, and that is only to produce the NAD that's needed for that oxidation phosphorylation. Anaerobic glycolysis is done only to produce the NAD so that we can go back up to glycolysis and produce a measly 2 ATP. So if you're exercising without oxygen, right, and you are working out anaerobically, not breathing enough, right, then you need to have anaerobic glycolysis happening to produce lactic acid in your cells that then cause them to hurt, right? Although there's some thought that it's not the lactic acid that causes your muscles to hurt. It's just the acid conditions around your cells that cause your muscles to hurt. But anyway, if you're working out anaerobically, then what we're doing is we're only doing it to produce this. We're going to take a closer look at this. If your yeast, and unfortunately we are not, but people were probably last night drinking some of the product of this. But if you're yeast, then you do anaerobic alcoholic fermentation and the bioreactors that they have at maybe the pump station. Do you ever see at the pump station where they have the big vats to make the beer? So here, they're doing the same thing. They're producing the NAD so that it can go back to glycolysis to make the measly 2 ATPs, right? But the product is ethanol and carbon dioxide. What we're going to study next, the next chapter, is aerobic oxidation. You have to have oxygen around. This is going to happen in the matrix, we're going to study the citric acid cycle that then is going to feed reduced coenzymes into our electron transport chain to make, wow, look at that, 30 ATPs. It is definitely worth it to have oxygen around. Oxygen is pretty reactive, and actually we have to worry about being in such a reactive environment, but we see its benefit in being able to make so many ATPs. But these poor guys, when you're not breathing right, or if you're a yeast, are doing some silly things to just try to get this NAD. All right, so let's study that. Apologize.
They make NAD to go back
Yeah.
to what?
To ATPs, yeah. It's good to go into glycolysis. We're going to look at that. So anaerobic metabolism. All right, actually, this is what we're going to study next. We're going to take, for aerobic metabolism, we're going to take the pyruvate in the pre-citric acid cycle, make acetyl-CoA. We're going to lose one of our carbon, the pyruvate is 3 carbons. We're going to lose one of the carbons. Acetyl is 2 carbons. This is it. And coenzyme A is a coenzyme that's going to help us along. We're going to get a little bit of money here, NADH, all right? And this is called the pre-citric acid cycle. But then we're going to take the acetyl-CoA and then bring it into the citric acid cycle and completely burn these carbons to carbon dioxide. But in that burning, in that oxidation, we're going to get NADH. But you can hold on to that. We're going to study that next. If you're running really hard and you're not breathing enough, then what we are doing is we are taking that pyruvate and reducing it to lactate. So this is a reduction. Pyruvate to lactate is a reduction. And so what we're doing is we're getting NAD and making NADH and making NAD. This NAD is then going to go back up, and I'll show that in the last slide. It's going to go back up to glycolysis. I'm not going to ask you questions about this enzyme. Just know that this is what's happening in your cells, and the only reason that anaerobic glycolysis happens is to get this NAD. If you're a yeast, then what you're going to do is you're going to take pyruvate and first make an aldehyde and then make our alcohol, ethanol. It takes a very complicated reaction to happen, but again, if you're a yeast, you're doing the same thing. We're not in an aerobic environment. We're not in an oxygen environment. So we're doing it to get the NAD to go back to glycolysis. So you need 2 enzymes to do this, pyruvate decarboxylase and alcohol dehydrogenase. We're going to see later that this TPP coenzyme plays a very important role in our pre-citric acid cycle. But again, for this, what I just need you to remember is that we're going to take pyruvate and make our alcohol so that we can get our NAD. And this is what our yeast does. I just want to show you very quickly, and we'll look at it again. TPP comes from vitamin B1, and it's very highly reactive. In this thiazole ring, what happens is right down here, it creates a carb anion, and it's going to carry the 2 carbons. So we're going to take, I'm not going to, I just wanted to show you the TPP because it was a new one, and we're going to take a closer look in the next chapter. So to end, what I can show you is, here is the reaction. It's actually reaction number 6 that happens in glycolysis, where we're taking our glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and adding that inorganic phosphate that I said, and having that phosphorylation and oxidation. And it needed, in order to have that oxidation, something had to be reduced, so we needed that NAD. So this up here, both here and here, that's step number 6. So you can circle it in your notes and say this is step number 6 from glycolysis. But if we don't have that NAD around, it's not going to happen, and we're not going to get the 2 ATPs from glycolysis. So that's the important part. If you don't have the NAD around for step number 6, where we have the oxidation and phosphorylation of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, then glycolysis is not going to happen. So in the absence of the citric acid cycle, in the absence of oxygen, this is what our cells do. If you are yeast, then you're going to go through alcoholic fermentation to make ethanol and the NAD that we need for step number 6. If you are us and you're not exercising well, then and taking in enough oxygen, then you're going to go to lactic acid fermentation. You can also call this anaerobic metabolism or anaerobic glycolysis, where we're going to take our pyruvate and make lactate and also the NAD. Yeah, these are both without the presence of oxygen.
So can you just say the lactic acid?
Sure. Lactic acid fermentation happens in us when you're not taking in enough oxygen. So when you're exercising and you're exercising anaerobically, you can't go through the citric acid cycle because you don't have enough oxygen. So what happens is we're trying desperately to get ATP so that we can move. And so, so our cells, our muscles can work, right? We need the ATP. So the only way that we can have our glycolysis occur is to have the presence of NAD. So this is a desperate measure to get NAD so we can get the measly 2 ATPs. So what happens is this is step number 6. Remember where we're phosphorylating that? And we needed the NAD. Remember I put that little star on that one step. So here, what we do is we take the pyruvate. So this, circle this and say this is from glycolysis. But what happens is at the end of glycolysis, what we're going to do instead of going into the citric acid cycle, if we had oxygen around, we're going to take lactate dehydrogenase and make lactic acid or lactate. But what we really need out of that is the NAD to go back up in there. NAD is necessary for glycolysis to happen. You need NAD around for glycolysis to happen. So the NAD is only needed in step number 6 here. And again, I don't want you to remember the steps by numbers. I want you to remember them by what's happening. The oxidation and phosphorylation of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. We're putting on that second phosphate. So we need that there. And that's the only step that we need NAD for in glycolysis. So really, both of these, the alcoholic fermentation and the lactic acid fermentation, are happening in order to get the NAD so that glycolysis can occur.